This was a time when Michigan was being logged big time. And so when the settlers finally came in, they were able to cut down trees, to use them to build their houses, to sell them in Grand Haven, to float them over to Grand Haven and sell them, to develop cash, and to interact with the surrounding economy while still remaining secure in their sort of isolation. So Van Malte, although friends of his told him you should go to Iowa, where there's wide open farmland, he said no, he thought people in Iowa had it too easy. There were too many worldly influences in Iowa. Besides, he didn't like the leader who was leading in Iowa, a fellow named Skolta. So he brought his group to Holland, Michigan. And it was in many ways a brilliant decision on his part. They were able to survive, they were able to sell their lumber, they were able to grow and develop. New waves of immigrants came in the years following 1846, so that by 1850 already, 1850 and 1855, there were a number of communities. There was Zeeland and Holland and Overijssel, all communities named after places, usually provinces, sometimes cities in the Netherlands. And there was a real colony here, and it was called a colony. It was, the Dutch word was used. This was a colony in America. Religiously, they were all separatist Calvinists. And although they had some very hard times in the early years, the winters were tough, a number of people died, there was malaria in the swamps and woodlands around Holland. That's a little hard for us to imagine now, but malaria was a real problem for a while in the earliest years. But they began to thrive, and they attracted a number of immigrants. Now, I think for those of you who are familiar with West Michigan, you may think that Dutch immigrants are a huge number of people. I don't know, I always thought that when I grew up. I grew up in Zeeland, you know. Holland was the big city, 5 miles away. Grand Rapids, I knew, had lots of Dutch people too. I thought there were Dutch people all over America. Turns out, that's not the case at all. The total number, according to Robert Swearingen, who's a fine historian who has done a lot of careful work with immigration records and other aspects of the Dutch experience. According to Robert Swearingen, the total number of Dutch immigrants to America from 1776 until right now is under 300,000. Less than 300,000. While Denmark, a much smaller country, sent over 1 million. Sweden, also a smaller country in terms of population than Holland, well over 1 million. Germany, Italy, Ireland, they sent millions and millions of immigrants to America. The Netherlands, less than 300,000. I find that kind of astonishing in some ways, and yet it shouldn't be surprising. The Netherlands was a prosperous society for the most part. It was a tolerant society for the most part. And so it didn't send that many of its people overseas. But those who came to West Michigan, to Iowa, and to a few other Dutch enclaves in the United States found themselves doing very well. They integrated quite easily into society in some respects. The very first year that the Dutch were in Holland, Michigan, they hired an English school teacher for their children. They were determined that the kids were going to learn English, even though for many years, until well into the first decade, second decade of the 20th century, till the 19-teens and 20s, there were still Dutch language newspapers being published here. But the schools were, from early on, were determined that English was the language. This was a permanent settlement. These immigrants did not figure they might go back to the Netherlands at some future time. They were here to stay. And they were dedicated to this society. By the time of the Civil War, this was a small community, but over 300 young men from Holland, Michigan, and the area, the colony there, enlisted in the Civil War. Now, they had only been in America as a group for 14 years at most, and yet they were committed to the sense of America as a unity. Excuse me, and there was a long Dutch tradition too of opposition to slavery, and so they had been sort of programmed from earlier years to see that as a significant cause. However, when the Dutch got to West Michigan, pure, the state church was impure. They were creating something more pure here in the woods. In relative isolation, they were working at their own lives, creating their own life, centered around the church, centered around what they saw as a godly view of the universe. And within 10 years of arrival, 1857 is when this actually happened, but by 1856 already, they were accusing each other of heresy. Terrible, terrible sins they were committing, according to the accusations. Now, I really wonder how many soul-destroying sins can be committed, even if they try. By a bunch of hard-working farmers who had to chop down these trees and had to drain the swamps and had to try to wring a living out of a difficult land. And yet, within 10 years, I thought I would quote a little bit of this. These church people were accusing each other of soul-destroying heresies. And allow me to read a couple of now, I'm choosing carefully. I'm not choosing the most significant issues, but these were all issues in the argument. The dissenters were opposed to hymns. Hymns are different from psalms. When you sing a psalm, you're singing the words of the Bible. When you sing a hymn, you're just singing words that some human being made up. Hymns was one problem. Funeral services was another. Having the dead body in church during a funeral. Flowers on caskets. Organs in church. Organ music in church was an issue. Fire insurance. A clear sign that you don't trust in the Lord if you get fired. Lightning rods. Clear sign of the same thing. Flowers on bonnets, white dresses, Christmas trees, vaccination, and finally, picnics. Well, the more serious doctrinal issues are hard for an outsider to understand too. One of those serious issues was a rumor that a preacher from the Reformed Church, while he was in New Jersey, talking to people from the old Dutch church in New Jersey, had allowed a non-Calvinist to accept communion at a church service. Somebody who wasn't a Calvinist, who wasn't a member of that church. That was one of the problems. Another problem was occasioned by a pastor in Zeeland, in my hometown. I was really sort of pleased to read about this pastor, but he was a grandfatherly figure, and he was a well-beloved pastor. And when his grandchildren just loved Opa, Grandpa. They called it the Dutch word Opa. This was in 1855. His grandchildren had a pet kitten that died. And they asked Opa, because they knew that he did funeral services. When somebody died, he would perform the service. They asked him if he would bury their kitten. He said, why, of course. Word got out. Here is this fellow desecrating the holy activities of the church and performing a funeral for a cat. These were farmers. Mostly, they were not people who had pets in their houses. Cats took care of the rats on your farm. They wouldn't have a funeral for a kitten any more than they would have a funeral for the hog they slaughtered last week so they could have some ham, you know?